Hello again, welcome back. And today we're going to carry our series of looking for the hard times in America, the way Jews faced crises in the past, what did they do about it, how did crisis affect their lives, and we are now going to look at the post-war years from 1945 through the 1950s. And maybe it's worth saying that in some ways, the Second World War, of course, ended in Europe and in the Asian theater in 1945, but in other ways, it didn't actually end, because as soon as the Second World War ended, the Cold War began. And the Cold War was also a shooting war in some parts of the world. The quest for understanding Jewish life in America, when we look at the 1950s, it's clear that we're not looking at a country that's really at peace. And even though it's tempting to think of it that way, and you know, we have this sort of popular image from TV and films about what the 50s were all about. Dwight Eisenhower was president. It was a time of normalcy, getting back to civilian life. All of those war veterans, those who lived to return to their lives as civilians. All of that is wrapped up in a package that we can conventionally think of as normalcy, but normalcy didn't really happen. I just, can mention what you see on the slide here is a private photo taken in Korea in December of 1951. This particular photo includes at the center, standing in the center, is the stage and film star Molly Picon, veteran of the Yiddish stage, and visiting together from the United States with Molly Picon was Cardinal Spellman and other important American cultural and figures, celebs, visiting with the troops overseas. And for some people, the war didn't really end, or at least we could say that the war continued in one form or another. The idea of reintegrating back into civilian life on the basis of the common experience of the nation at war, the common experience of combat soldiers fighting together against a common enemy. All of this was promised under the slogan of normalcy. And we can see these ideas in visual form encapsulated in monuments raised to the memory of the fallen soldiers. This particular one is located in Brownsville, in Brooklyn, in Zion Park. Actually, it's an interesting sidelight that particular part of Brownsville, which was once a very, very Jewish neighborhood, almost, virtually totally a Jewish neighborhood of Jewish immigrants and their children back in the 1910s and 20s. And this particular park near Pitkin Avenue is called Zion Park, partly because one of the streets near the park is named for Theodor Herzl. It was named in his honor after his death in 1904. And Brooklyn is one of the only places outside of the state of Israel where there is a Herzl Street. And this is Zion Park with the Jewish monument to the soldiers who gave their lives fighting for the United States. But this return to normalcy, as I say, can sometimes be overblown. And the other term that is sometimes given to the 1950s is the age of anxiety. Anxiety specifically on the front of the Cold War, the issue of the new enemy being communism. How can communism be opposed abroad and prevented from any influence or attempts to infiltrate the United States at home from within? And these were the causes for anxiety. And because they affected the United States, they also affected the Jews of the United States, as we've seen in previous chapters. Just to refresh your memories, in 1950s, there were hearings held in Congress. The House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, conducted extensive hearings, subpoenaed testimony. People were blacklisted for having in the past or at present any association with anyone who could be labeled a communist. Labor unions were purged. People lost their jobs in New York City schools alone. There were over 250 teachers who were sacked from their jobs because of their alleged ties to the radical left. We're coming up until the most famous episode of the early 1950s, the trial and subsequent execution of the Rosenbergs, who were convicted for spying, stealing atomic secrets and handing them over to the Soviet Union during the Second World War. That is, the spying took place during the Second World War. The Soviets made use of those secrets when they proceeded after the Second World War to perfect their own nuclear weapon. And as most of you, if not all of you, will recall, both the Rosenbergs were executed, even though the case against Ethel Rosenberg was certainly far less cut and dried. The point is, however, the Rosenbergs were Jewish, obviously. They were Jewish communists. Did they ever take a position as Jews? Well, no. The Communist Party made it their business to present this issue as if it were yet another example of fascist America persecuting Jews and black people and everyone that they didn't like. Nevertheless, the fact that the entire trial, the judge, the prosecutor, the defendants, all were Jews in this sort of opera of the Cold War, the Jews and America. The fact that this happened, of course, had a ripple effect. It had a long-lasting ripple effect on the way Jews and other Americans thought about the future of their country and the present crisis facing the United States in the age of nuclear weapons. And it certainly colored what we think of as the age of normalcy and made it more like the age of anxiety. And let me talk for a few minutes with you about how this impacted the survivors of the Holocaust specifically. That was the point where we ended up last time. The fact that there were several 100,000 Jews, survivors and refugees, living in Allied occupied Europe in 1946, 1947, 1948, before there was a state of Israel, meant that their status, along with the millions of other displaced persons, war refugees and others, whose fate now lay in the hands of the Western allies who were in charge. Their welfare, their health care, their food, their clothing, where they were going to end up, all of this had to be decided. For the most part, the policy adopted in Washington and London was to encourage all of the refugees and displaced persons of whatever nationality to return home to where they were living before the war. This was the general policy, and it was thought that over time, this reservoir of millions of displaced refugees would begin to dry up and people would go home. And life could return to something approaching normal. But because of the report given to President Truman by his close advisor, Harrison, who said, first of all, the Jews in these DP camps are not being treated as people who had actually survived a genocide. They were living together in the same refugee camps, in the same DP camps, alongside Germans and Ukrainians and Poles and others who were in fact war criminals or had collaborated with war criminals. Something had to be done to recognize the separate status of the Jews who had survived the Holocaust and to decide on a policy level what would be the best thing, considering that most of these Jewish survivors expressly said to whatever delegation was visiting that they didn't have much interest in returning home to where they lived before the war. Many of them said they wanted to go to Palestine. Many of them said they would like to go to America or elsewhere in the West. And that is why among the recommendations that Truman accepted was that, okay, the first thing we should do is try to get as many of these 100,000, that is a nice round number. Let's convince our allies, the British, to let these people enter Palestine before they close the gate on any further Jewish immigration there. And there was an Anglo-American commission to deal with this, and in the end, nothing happened. That is, the British refused. The quest for, well, where will these people go, will carry on over the coming few years. But this is where the Cold War gets involved. Among all of these millions of displaced persons, war refugees, and former collaborators with the Nazis and so forth, among these, there were many people who were now afraid to go back home to Poland or to Hungary or Czechoslovakia because the Reds were in charge and they knew their fate if they were suspected of being war criminals of one kind or another. These Ukrainians and Poles and Hungarians and others did not want to go home again. They wanted to be protected. They wanted, as anti-Soviets, anti-communists, they wanted to be protected. And they had their lobbies in the United States, mainly church groups associated with the various East European nationalities, Lithuanians and Latvians and Poles and so forth. What would be the solution? The United States decided, as a matter of policy, through these various DP acts that were passed in Congress in 48, 50, and 52, to favor a certain kind of refugee, that is, those people who could prove that they were not underground agents of communism, who could prove that they were anti-communist, and who could be said to be useful to the recovering American economy, as farmers or what have you. That meant that in the end, the Displaced Persons Acts that were passed through Congress were explicit in the way that they favored non-Jewish DPs over Jews, some of whom could be suspected of Soviet, pro-communist leanings. They were anti-fascist, and so on and so forth. These are all very, very easy stereotypes that can be bandied about. I remind you that even before the war, American policymakers were never very Jewish-friendly, if we could put it that way. And so when it came down, when push came to shove, Congress passed this kind of discriminatory DP Act to admit DPs from Europe into the United States as immigrants, but with these explicit formulas in place that would make it far harder for Jews to be among those admitted. Truman vetoed the bill when it was passed in that form, and nevertheless Congress passed the bill over Truman's veto. In the end, there were about 400,000 DPs admitted to the United States between 1948 and 1954. Of that 400,000, 100,000 were Jews. That is 1/4 of all of the war survivors, refugees, and Holocaust survivors. 1/4 of those admitted to the United States were Jews. Just to give you a sort of a basis for comparison, both before 1948 and obviously after 1948 with the establishment of Israel, over 450,000 Holocaust survivors from Europe did immigrate to Palestine and Israel. So it's 4 times and more, almost 5 times as many Jews who survived the Holocaust went to Israel, 5 times more than they went to the United States. And this was not necessarily because they were all so gung-ho to become Israelis, but also because it was very, very difficult to get visas to enter the United States. But this isn't the end of the story. To get 100,000 Jews into the United States in 1950 and 1952, under the shadow of the Cold War, under the shadow of the Rosenberg's case, under the shadow of McCarthy and the anti-communist crusade, to get 100,000 Jews into the United States required the Jewish community agencies to come to terms with the other interested parties in the refugee policy-making community, that is, the churches and the humanitarian groups, all of whom were pushing for the protection to be granted to these DPs and other non-Jews coming out of Europe at the end of the war who were claiming to have been war refugees and were admitted to the United States. Among those 300,000 non-Jews admitted to the United States, some, a small number, but some, were Nazis, Nazi collaborators of one degree or another. There are several important cases that became famous later on because of the extradition of these people, such as John Ivan Demjanjuk. These people were admitted to the United States partly because the Jewish community representatives, the Jewish organizations, knew that they would have to turn a blind eye to this sort of shenanigan being pushed by the non-Jewish groups if they wanted the support of those non-Jewish groups to bring the 100,000 Jews into the United States. So there was a kind of a tacit quid pro quo going on under the table. Jews were getting the support they wanted for Jewish refugee assistance, but the coin that had to be paid was don't interfere with what the church groups were up to in terms of whom they were bringing in on their lists. The age of anxiety in terms of the Cold War is also, of course, the age of the beginning of desegregation on the home front, on the domestic front in the United States. The racial issues that were boiling already under the surface in the United States in the 1920s, in the 1930s, the era of the KKK and Jim Crow, this comes to a head. After the end of World War II, Jews went to fight in the Second World War and came home, those who came home, and black Americans went to fight in the Second World War, and those who were able came home, and both Jews and blacks who were war veterans and their families and their communities believed that having fought, having served their country and fought the country's enemies and fought for the values of freedom, democracy, human dignity, that having done all of that, it now behooved the United States to live up to those ideals. And that's why the 1950s is the period of the push, the first big activist push towards desegregation, primarily with the focus on the South, but not only. I have to remind you that segregated public facilities such as hotels and whatnot were still the current practice, even outside of the South proper, in Washington, in the Midwest. But not only that, until President Truman ordered the desegregation of the American armed forces, the American armed forces that fought in World War II were segregated. That is to say, black soldiers were in black units, often officered by white officers. At any rate, the issue of desegregation comes to a head after World War II for all of those reasons named. And the most famous turning point, or the case that people point to as the signpost of what the battle ahead to come between 1954, the Supreme Court decision in the case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which knocked down the principle of separate but equal, which had been the rule up until then. Between 1954 and the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in 1964, that era, those 10 years of struggle that have gone down in history in the United States, obviously involved black Americans front and center, but it involved their allies as well. But it also involved their opponents. And here is where the issue becomes very sticky when looking at it as a Jewish crisis. Now, we saw in previous chapters or sessions that we've had that whatever critical issue faced the United States as a nation, Jews also faced those issues, and very often they were split in how to approach these issues. And the same thing was going to happen with desegregation, partly because, although most of the Jews of the United States lived in the states located in the North or the Midwest or the West Coast, a considerable part of the Jewish population lived in the South, in the segregated South. The Jews in the South were themselves divided about the wisdom of desegregation. Some said that they were for desegregation but didn't want to say so publicly. Some said Jews should not be in the forefront of this sort of thing because we know what anti-Semitism is like, and we will be punished for any involvement that we take in the struggle for civil rights for black Americans. And people in the South, generally, including Jews, tended to view the people up north who were pushing them to act as people who didn't understand reality on the ground. That is to say, once again, Jewish society becomes split by a national issue that has become critical. Most specifically is that these fears or these inhibitions voiced by Jews in the South, they weren't just somebody's figment of the imagination. Because of the close association of Jewish organizations, especially in the North, with the civil rights campaign and struggle, and the close alliance between black activists and Jewish activists in the North, and those going south to fight the good fight because of that close association, which was well known and in the public mind. Jewish houses of worship took the brunt of the white extremist backlash against desegregation, along with black churches. The firebombing and destruction of black churches and the deaths that occurred in black churches are on the public record and well known. What is less known are the cases of the synagogues that were firebombed or dynamited or whose bombings were attempted. Luckily, in those incidents, and I've listed 10 of those incidents here on this slide. Luckily, no Jewish lives were claimed by these acts of violence. But the violence was there. It was there in the towns that you see listed here, in Nashville, in Miami, in Jacksonville, in Birmingham, in Atlanta, and even going Midwest, in Peoria, in Illinois. So it was an issue that we could say Jews were perhaps justified in understanding that the push to desegregate American society and to change the racial politics of America that had persisted since before the Civil War and gotten worse after the Civil War and became critical for Jewish people in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, this idea that Jews as a race should be treated differently because of that. All of that really, once again, comes to a head in these particular episodes and incidents. The idea that synagogues under attack are something new that we're experiencing only in our day. Well, this obviously is not true. There is a history. The ones that I've listed here are only from two particular years, from 1957 and 1958, when there was this wave of attacks against synagogues. But we come back to the underlying question of how do Jews respond to this sort of thing? We'll try to address that at the end, but here we have to factor in one more thing. The 1950s is also the first decade of the existence of Israeli statehood. The War of Israeli Independence in 1948 ends in the ceasefire agreements of 1949. There's a tremendous Jewish consensus in the United States in favor of the establishment of the state and the support of the state, a tremendous outpouring not only of financial support, but of heavy political support in terms of voting for sympathetic congressmen and senators at the federal level and at the state level and at the municipal level. And in general, the idea that Jews, after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, with the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jews having joined coalitions to fight the good fight on the domestic front, on the foreign front in Europe and against the Japanese on the Asian theater of the war and in the Korean War, all of this means that Jews now have a place to claim as equal, full citizens of equal status with everyone else in the United States. This is part of what I referred to earlier as the normalcy package. How does Israel factor into all of that? And this is an issue that, once again, has particular resonance for us today. But now I'm asking you to look back to the 1950s to see when all of this really gestates. So as early as 1950, this is just a year after the ceasefire agreements in Israel and the hostilities between Israel and the various Arab countries surrounding Israel, the need to establish what were the boundaries of American Jewish involvement in the State of Israel, support for the State of Israel. Where do the boundaries lie? And remember, this is the 1950s, the Cold War, looking for spies and undercover operatives under the blanket, and questioning the loyalty of everyone from school teachers to army generals to movie stars. And questioning loyalty was part of the anxiety of America in the 1950s. And Jews in 1950 were not about to let their loyalty to the United States be questioned. And so there had to be boundaries. There was a protocol, an agreement of sorts, reached in 1950 between the man who headed the American Jewish Committee, one of the important Jewish community organizations then as now. Jacob Blaustein was a millionaire, an oil tycoon, very close to the American administration. Blaustein and Israel's Prime Minister Ben-Gurion decided that it was a time to enunciate some sort of rule book. What were both Israel and American Jewry going to support wholeheartedly together? Well, the one thing that they were going to support together was the thriving of the State of Israel as a place where Jews could come together under the right of self-determination and build a country and build a society imbued with the ideals of democracy, freedom, equality, and so forth. That was fine. What was not going to be together, what was going to be done separately, however, was how was this support to be expressed? Israelis, as citizens, were going to be called upon to express their loyalty to their new nation in ways that all citizens of all countries do. They pay their taxes, they serve in the army, they vote in the elections. American Jews are not citizens of Israel. They are citizens of the United States. And therefore, all of their civic loyalty is owing to their country, the United States, and they will not participate, they will not even be called upon by Israel's leaders to participate directly in any other form other than sympathy, financial support, and public opinion, political support, if you will, but not direct involvement in the ways that could be described as the proper purview of those who are citizens of the country. And there had to be a clear line. The creation of Jewish sovereignty in Israel introduced the problem of sovereignty for Jews living outside. They were not part of the sovereign state of Israel. They were part of the sovereign state where they lived. And these were all laid out as principles in this agreement between Ben-Gurion and Blaustein. This is all well and good if you can keep things in a well-ordered, separate kind of business as usual. What happens when crisis occurs? And crisis occurs in 1956 when the Egyptian leader Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, together with Israel, decide to stop Nasser. Britain, France, and Israel declare war, invade. Israel occupies the Sinai Peninsula. All of this is done without the United States agreeing, without the United States supporting. In fact, the United States and the Soviet Union, in a rare moment of agreement, came together in opposing the entire Suez operation and Sinai operation. Eisenhower forced Israel to withdraw from the Sinai eventually. What is interesting to us in this particular moment is that in the lead up to the crisis in 1956 and during the crisis of fall 56 and the months and years following, American Jewish organizations upped their game. That is to say, they knew that they needed, not just on paper, but also in life, in actual acts, to raise the ante, to become more involved politically in the foreign affairs of their country, because the foreign affairs of their country were having an impact on Israel and on the Jewish people. And those are the years when we see the early beginnings of the Israel lobby in the United States, what became AIPAC eventually. We also see the formation of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. Washington, of course, was well informed about what was going on in the American Jewish public. And Washington, during the Suez Crisis, the State Department and the White House tried to use the American Jewish organizations as a back channel for the Americans to pass policy messages and warnings and even threats to the Israeli government to back down and to toe the line and to do what the Americans would tell them to do. The Jews in the United States were being used this way, as I say, as a kind of a back channel for Washington to send messages to Jerusalem. And the Jews weren't terribly happy about it, and they weren't having it. We come to the final few minutes, and I do want to sum up with you some of the things that we've learned. One thing is that crisis, when it happens in the United States, affects Jews. No matter if Jews are a small part of the population, they are an important part of the population, if only because they live in what might be called the nerve centers of contemporary American life, in the big cities, well situated in terms of the electoral college votes and so forth, but also because Jews are participants fully in everything that happens in the United States. They will split. They will have different opinions about what needs to be done. What allows the Jews to carry on from crisis to crisis is the ability to call upon their own resources, to mobilize their own resources and respond to crisis in various ways. In the past, as we've seen, they've done it sometimes with some success, as with the abrogation of the commercial treaty with Russia in 1911, and sometimes they failed, as in the case of keeping the gates of immigration open to the United States in 1921 or 1938 or 1940 or even 1950. Those were failures, but they didn't fail to act. And the reason why they acted was because they had effective leadership. And one of the cases in which we have to face our own present moment is the question, do the Jews of the United States still have the resources to field those kinds of responses given the way life has become privatized, virtualized, large organizations diminished, denigrated, or what have you. One final word. These lessons, if we can call them such, that we try to learn from the past, show that Jews cannot respond to crisis if they don't demand accountability from the authorities, from the people who are supposedly representing them in positions of power. Demanding the accountability, whether they succeed or fail, the demand has to be voiced in order for there to be any kind of give and take between the United States and its Jewish citizens. I thank you all for your attention. I hope this has been of interest, and I welcome your comments and questions after you've watched these sessions. Be well.